I'm Daniel Levine, and this is the Bio Report. The search for non-opioid pain relievers has focused on pharmaceutical alternatives, including non-steroidal anti-inflammatories, antidepressants, and anticonvulsants. Brixton Biosciences is developing neural ice, an injectable frozen slurry that can degenerate nerves in targeted areas and provide pain relief for extended periods. The discovery capitalizes on unexpected findings about the effects of a fat-reducing cosmetic procedure. We spoke to Sameer Sabir, co-founder and CEO of Brixton Biosciences, about the unmet need for pain management, how neural ice works, and the company's initial focus on osteoarthritis and post-operative knee pain. Sameer, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Daniel. I appreciate it.
We're going to talk about pain, the need for non-opioid pain relievers that could provide long-term pain control, and Brixton Biosciences' efforts to develop an injectable pain reliever that can desensitize a targeted area. Let's start with the problem you're trying to address. How widely prescribed are opioids today, and how big a problem does opioid addiction remain?
That's a great question, Daniel. Opioids are still very widely used. They are certainly down from their peak from a utility standpoint. The opioid crisis, one could say, potentially started in the mid 2000s when opioids were being prescribed, left, right, and center for everything, and the number of prescriptions since then has certainly declined. But addiction is up and deaths are up primarily because of the use of illicit opioids. So the opioid crisis has now become much more than just the prescription of opioids. It's become a much bigger global health problem, if you like. Now, what I would say is that I think developing a non-opioid or opioid-free drug or product has become a bit of a buzzword. I think the way to think about it is slightly different. Opioid abuse is certainly one component of the issue when it comes to managing pain, and the opioid crisis is a huge problem. That said, chronic pain is the most costly and impactful public health problem today, according to the recent Global Burden of Disease survey, and the opioid piece kind of fits into that. I think what we should be focusing on is the fact that pain in and of itself is a public health crisis and is not particularly well managed.
Well, beyond abuse, there are other problems with the use of opioids on a prolonged basis. How problematic are those other effects? And I know many people are both fearful of the risk of addiction, but also these other effects. So, how does this figure into the ability of doctors or their willingness to address concerns
Yeah,
about pain?
sure. So, one of the most significant problems with opioids is that you develop tolerance to them. So you take a dose, your body eventually gets used to that dose, and then you need to take more of a dose to get sort of the same clinical benefit. But you don't develop a tolerance to the side effects. The side effects don't respond in the same way, and so opioids have pretty significant side effects aside from addiction that range from issues that could be considered relatively minor, such as itching and constipation, all the way up to things such as hypogonadism. It's a much bigger issue than just addiction itself. And Clinicians are certainly, I don't know if hesitant is the right word, much more careful when it comes to prescribing opioids now than they once used to be. And I think it's important at this point to sort of differentiate between episodes of care when it comes to pain. Generally speaking, we think about pain in two buckets. We think about post-surgical or acute pain, traumatic pain because of an accident or something along those lines, and then we think about chronic pain, and they're two very different scenarios. So I would say that on the acute pain side, for surgery and for other acute reasons, opioids still maintain an important role in the sort of mainstream approach to care. Although there have been huge efforts to try and reduce the amount of opioids that are prescribed in those contexts, it still is used and used, some would say appropriately. Although it's interesting that in a recent study looking at orthopedic surgeons prescribing habits for opioids post knee replacement, they actually prescribe more than they think they prescribe. So they think they're prescribing less than they actually give the patient. There's still an issue there. On the chronic pain side, um, the use of opioids for the management of chronic pain has significantly decreased, which has obviously uh, left gaps when it comes to caring for these patients. Trying to address the addiction issue has created other problems elsewhere because of this hole that's now left.
Well, what does the arsenal of pain medications look like today, and where are there gaps in treatment options?
Yeah. So again, if we sort of segment down into the two episodes of care, acute pain and chronic pain, and I'm going to generalize a little bit, but let's say you're having a knee replacement surgery, and that's actually one of the indications we're very interested in. uh, what happens. The patient comes into the operating room or into the anesthesia holding room prior to going into the OR, and they're given a bunch of local anesthetics into the knee. During surgery, more local anesthetic is put into the knee, and then they come out of the OR into the recovery room. Those local anesthetics last maybe a day, maybe two, and then the patient's basically on pills, whether on opioids or something else. They're on systemic medication to manage pain all the way through their recovery. So that's what happens on the acute side, generally speaking. On the chronic side, um, it's it's a little bit more fragmented. But again, if we take a knee patient as an example, uh, the first intervention for a patient who has chronic pain in the knee from osteoarthritis may be physical therapy, it may be other, non medication related modalities. But then the first real intervention in these patients is typically a shot of steroid into the knee to see if that can help with the issue. And it's not great for patients to have too many shots of steroid into one joint. And so you may get one or two of those. And then there are some other bits and pieces that you can try, such as visco supplements that try and actually prevent the bone from rubbing on the bone. But then there's this huge kind of gap until you get to the point where a patient needs a knee replacement. And that's a big part of where the chronic pain gap lies, is in this big delta between these relatively um, uh, low burden interventions and then sort of the surgical option. That's a lot of time and a lot of pain to manage in that time. Like, so those are just sort of that's just using the knee as an example. You can obviously extrapolate that to many different things. Pain is so heterogeneous and it's such a big issue. There's no panacea for pain either, right? We talk about the problem. The problem is multifaceted and large, and the solution also needs to be multimodal. And uh, there's no, I don't think there's sort of one, silver bullet that fixes everything.
Well, it seems to me that for as long as I can remember, there's been an effort to find alternatives to opioids. Why have we seen so little innovation in this area?
That is a great question. I think opioids are cheap. We know they work. Um, they have this very unfortunate side effect, addiction, but until that became a very major problem, there was, I think, very little uh, economic incentive to develop an alternative. I think it's that's a big part of the story, honestly speaking. And Now, almost the opposite is true. There is a significant amount of activity in looking for opioid alternative solutions to treating pain, which is great and appropriate. But I think the problem itself has become a lot bigger than just the opioid crisis.
Brixton's working to develop what it calls neural ice. This is a drug free injectable therapy. What is neural ice?
Uh, so neural ice is essentially the product is a simple prefilled syringe that contains a formulation. The formulation is a drug-free composition, essentially of a bunch of excipients or inactive ingredients, which, when frozen, form this form of engineered ice that we call neural ice, and it's ice that is essentially intended to be able to flow through a small needle so that it can be injected around whichever nerve the clinician chooses to inject around. And it essentially extracts heat or energy from the surrounding tissue in such a way that it induces this desensitization of the nerve that we're looking for in order to provide patients with pain relief.
This is a Brixton is a spin out of Mass General Brigham. How was neural ice first discovered?
It's a great story. The inventor of the technology that Brixton is now developing was also the inventor of the technology that ultimately became cool sculpting. Cool sculpting is a non-invasive way to remove fat for the purposes of body sculpting. It's aesthetic medicine. And Professor Rox Anderson invented that technology at MGH back in, I think it was 2008 or 2009. Um, and very quickly observed that many of the patients who were undergoing the cool sculpting treatment experienced a fairly sustained period of numbness at the site where they received the treatment. And Rox and his team got very interested as to why that was happening, because if you think about it, you put an ice pack on a sprain, it deadens the pain whilst the ice pack is on, but once you remove the ice pack, the pain comes back quite quickly. And so why, when these patients were receiving cool sculpting, were they seeing this numbness that lasted for months? And they identified that the cutaneous nerves in the region where the treatment was taking place were undergoing this process called Wallerian degeneration, which is this reversible degeneration of the nerve. And the reason that was happening was that these nerves are surrounded by a myelin sheath. A myelin sheath is essentially lipid-rich tissue that forms the sheath that helps the nerve to conduct signals. And those lipid-rich cells in the myelin sheath were undergoing the same process that the fat cells that cool sculpting targets in the subcutaneous fat were undergoing. So they were accidentally giving cool sculpting to nerves. Basically, that's how this came about.
And how targeted are the effects of the therapy? How difficult is it to deliver to where you want it to go?
Yeah, great question. So we have been very focused on making sure that we develop a product that is as close as possible from a use case standpoint to injecting a local anesthetic. Local anesthetics are well understood. Um, they're easy to utilize, and neural ice should be no different. The goal is to inject the material around the nerve, and actually, the fact that it's an injectable or an infiltrate kind of gets away from some of the other some of the issues surrounding some of the other treatments in the chronic pain modality, where in the chronic pain world, where you may try to, burn or freeze a nerve by putting a probe on it in order to zap the nerve. That's something that's often used in cases where patients have intractable pain, and you have to be very precise and very targeted and get that probe right on the nerve. In the case of neural ice, we like to say that it's precisely imprecise or imprecisely precise, whichever way around you want to take it. The goal is really to be able to inject in the region of the nerve, and that is enough to hit the target as long as you're in the ballpark, as it were.
And what's known about the durability of the pain relief that neural ice is able to provide?
So we have just started enrollment in our first major pivotal study, which is a randomized controlled study comparing neural ice to steroid in around 260, 270 patients. That will inform us, much more robustly on the actual durability of neural ice. But in our early clinical work, where we conducted pilot studies to look at safety as a primary endpoint and so on and so forth, we did see that patients seem to fairly reliably be achieving several months of relief. I would say 3 to 6 months from that early data. But we want to do the work and do it well, and do the studies robustly in such a way that we get more accurate information around that.
Any sense of whether there's numbness or loss of sensation in the area it's delivered beyond the quieting of pain that you're seeking?
Yeah, again, great question. Not really. We're targeting nerves that are fairly deep in the knee, and there does not seem to be, at least from the early clinical work, any adverse events related to numbness at the surface where the patients were treated. So it's been quite nice to see the specificity of the product in those early studies.
And my understanding from what you said earlier is this is delivered in a pre-filled vial or pre-filled injection. Is it have to be maintained at a certain temperature, or do end users just freeze it?
Yeah, yeah. So the way the product is currently configured for our clinical study, it is shipped at room temperature, stored at room temperature, and then placed in the freezer the night before it's due to be used, and then taken out and injected. So all of the shipping and storage is done at room temperature, but the freezing occurs 24 hours prior to the treatment. Our goal when we go to market with this is actually for the pre-filled syringe to be frozen upon demand in the packaging when the product needs to be used. So if you imagine shipping and storing the pre-filled syringe at room temperature, and then pulling a tab or something similar when you want to use it, and that freezes the syringe in its packaging. Just take it out and use it. That's the dream. That's where we hope we get to when we get to commercial launch. And our team is very hard at work trying to make that happen.
You mentioned the clinical study. What is the inclusion criteria for the clinical study? What types of pain are you looking at, and what are you using as endpoints for that?
Yeah, so we're trying to be fairly conservative and go joint by joint. We're interested primarily, at least initially, in musculoskeletal pain. So we're starting with the knee. So these are all patients who have chronic osteoarthritis of the knee with moderate to severe pain. They need to pass a threshold in terms of how much pain they have in their knee in order to be included in the study. And then they're randomized. It's a 2-to-1 randomization. The treatment cohort receives neural ice, and the control cohort receives a shot of steroid into the joint in the knee. And I think that the one really important aspect of our study is that it is actually not what the inclusion criteria are, but what exclusion criteria we don't have. We are not excluding patients based on BMI. So if you look at pain studies in order to try and optimize for the perfect patient, the weight or BMI of those patients is restricted. But we decided, based on what we saw in our early pilot studies, to actually not restrict the BMI at all. As long as the needle is long enough to reach the site, there are no restrictions on the BMI of the patient, which we think will be a pretty significant differentiator for our study.
And if you're using a steroid as a for the placebo or the control, uh, is temperature an issue? Do people will people know they're getting the actual experimental therapy based on the sensation of cold?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I mean, we chose to use an active control rather than a placebo for not for a number of reasons. So patients do know whether they're in the treatment arm or not, but they are receiving an active therapy, and so it's an appropriate study design. And we believe that comparing to an active control that is well understood from the perspective of its treatment profile and its placebo effects will actually give us, much more practical, granular, real-world data around how this therapy can be deployed relative to steroid and other treatments.
Given that you have to be able to inject into or near the nerve, how broad a set of indications might this be useful in?
Uh, we I would say on average have one light bulb moment around where else this could be used per week. So, as with any startup, we have a number of really exciting ideas, and we're trying to balance that with being focused and going one step at a time. To answer your question, essentially anywhere that one could target the nerve, both for the treatment of pain or for other reasons, could potentially be a potential indication for neural ice, which is why we find it so exciting. Um, but from a company standpoint, we're starting with the knee, and we're actually going to be initiating a hip pilot study in the very near future as well, and also a hand indication later this year. And those are the three indications within the musculoskeletal system that we're going to go after first of all, and then downstream in the future, who knows? Sky's the limit.
And what's the development path forward?
So this pivotal study that I've described to you a little earlier, that'll hopefully be our regulatory study that we will go to FDA with for a marketing authorization later next year, if all goes according to plan. So that will be our first product, first indication. The goal would be to be on the market in early 2027, and then with the subsequent indications following, thereafter.
And is this expected to be regulated as a drug?
No, it will be regulated as a device, and it's driven primarily by the fact that this is a physical mechanism of action as opposed to a biochemical mechanism of action. But I think you actually raise a really good point when it comes to how we think about pain. We've sort of fallen into this trap of thinking about things in the context of drugs and devices, and it really creates these silos when it comes to thinking about how we treat pain. And our product is an injectable in a syringe, and to all extents and purposes would be used in a very similar fashion to how a drug would be used, but it's not a drug. So how do we think about that from sort of a global perspective? And I think there are also other technologies where those lines are getting a little bit blurred. And what we really care about is the benefit the patient receives, and not necessarily the way that it's categorized when it comes to. But that has real impact when it comes to how the product gets paid for example. So I think that there needs to be a broader discussion around that topic as well.
At the start of the year, the No Pain Act took effect. This is legislation intended to expand access to non opioid pain management options for Medicare patients. What's the potential impact of this legislation on Brixton?
It's a good question. I think it's unclear at this point exactly how we may or may not be able to benefit from or leverage the No Pain Act. But I think the fact that it exists in the first place is very important indicator of how important this issue is and the fact that it needs to be addressed. So whether we benefit from the No Pain Act or not, just the fact that it's raising awareness around this issue is critical. And we were awarded breakthrough designation by the FDA last year for this device for our first indication, and so we think that will also sort of feed into our go-to-market strategy, and whether it's that or no pain that helps us to get to market and to help patients. The goal really is just to be able to deploy this in a way that it's widely adopted and help as many patients as possible.
Brixton completed a 33 million Series B financing in 2024. How far will existing cash take you, and what's the plan for raising additional capital?
So we're now well funded through all of our clinical work that I've described to you. So our regulatory studies in knee and in hip, and some additional work in some of the other indications that we're interested in. The money will essentially get us through, uh, hopefully, the approval process, and the goal would be to then think about how we commercialize and raise accordingly. And we have a very supportive group of insiders, and hope they will, take us all the way through.
You did raise money in what's generally been a difficult financing environment for younger companies. What's the discussion with investors like, and why do you think you were successful?
It certainly is a very challenging environment, no doubt about it. But I think the ability to be able to clearly define a problem and describe how there is a solution that addresses it, that meets the needs of both patients and also payers, and demonstrate that there's at least a possibility that the economics stack up as well as providing a benefit to the patient. I think that uh, the investment community is really um, focused on the lowest common denominator at this point, which is triangulating on the that sort of component of the diagram where everything overlaps. And I think with Brixton, we had very solid early clinical data. We have a reasonably clear pathway from a payment standpoint, and breakthrough device designation certainly helped with that. And a team that has uh, been able to execute previously, and I hope those are the things that investors saw in us that convinced them to uh, take a punt on Brixton.
Sameer Sabir, co-founder and CEO of Brixton Biosciences. Sameer, thanks so much for your time today.
Thanks again for having me, Daniel. Appreciate it.
Thanks for listening. The Bio Report is a production of the Levine Media Group. To automatically download this podcast each week, subscribe to our RSS feed or through iTunes or other podcast manager. To join our mailing list, go to levinemediagroup.com. We'd love to hear from you. If you want to drop us a line or are interested in sponsoring this podcast, send email to danny@levinemediagroup.com. Special thanks to Jonah Levine, who composed our theme music, and the Jonah Levine Collective, which performs it.